Madam President, as past chair of the Asiad, you perhaps have had a special Asian perspective on the importance of global trade that is reinforced by your own experience with remittances redistributed to the Philippines economy. What do you see as the best approach? Do we need to jumpstart the multilateral approach like Doha, or can we find comfort in a new regionalism of trade if we don't do Doha?
Well, first of all, what's the best approach to rebooting the world economy? That's the title of our session today. And when you talk about rebooting the global economy, that suggests something pretty radical, because when you reboot a computer, you have to turn it off first. But when we reboot an economy, we cannot turn it off. We cannot wipe the slates clean before we can start all over again, because there are people involved, there are lives involved. So what is very important here is that we must not neglect those who feel the hardship of the global downturn the most, and that is the poor. And any solution must take that into account. So in the Philippines, we took our bitter medicine years ago when we had our very painful fiscal reforms and financial reforms. So when the world crisis struck, we had the revenues to be able to invest in people as well as in infrastructure for the fiscal stimulus. And that is why in 2007, we had an 8% GNP growth, and in 2008, a 6% GNP growth. But having said that, and making sure that, that any radical change is not at the back is not on the back of those who can least afford it, we do need radical rethinking in the world. Number one, we need a fundamental reform of the global financial regulation. Number two, Doha must continue, must be completed. And that is where the interests of the developing countries can take the rightful place in the global structure of the economy. And third, the G7 must expand into a G20 or even a G30.
Mr. Prime Minister, on that slide. Madam President, when you hear all of this consternation and confusion, mostly within the G7, about bad banks and the difficulty in dealing with this unraveling financial system, mostly in the G7 economies, how do you have any optimism that we are going to move to a G20 regime when there's so much obsession at the moment within the G7 with its own peculiar problems?
Well, as the others have said in this table, in this platform, the meeting of the G20 in April is going to be a very important meeting. So that's already one. That's already one indication how important and how useful the G20 can be. But we must even go beyond the G20, because we need to have represented in the coordinated policy making of the world diverse kinds of economies. Because if we don't have these diverse economies represented on the table, then perspective will be lost and new ideas will not be gained. And furthermore, it is ironic that the developing countries now are doing better than the developed countries. And yet, if they will not have a say in how to structure the world economy, that's really wrong. So we need to have the developing countries represented in a bigger way. They have something to share. How are they able to keep their countries resilient? They have that to share. And another way by which we make the G20 or the G30 more successful or assure its success is that it should be complemented by the regional alliances being consulted more closely and being meshed together among themselves.
And Mr. Prime Minister, do you think you could identify?
Thank you. I'm Nelson Schwartz of the New York Times. I have a question for Mrs. Macapagal Arroyo and Senor Gloria. Given your experience in developing economies, I'm curious if you're concerned about the United States approach here in terms of the amount of borrowing. It looks like Washington is about to embark on more than $2 trillion and whether that will crowd out funds available for countries like the Philippines and for Mexico. And at the same time, seems like there's some signs of protectionism, and I'm curious, again, from emerging countries, how you feel about that, especially when it was U.S. borrowing and U.S. excesses that most leaders are willing to say was, like even Gordon Brown are willing to say was the origins of this crisis. Thank you.
Well, with regard to the credit market and the crowding out, actually, as far as the Philippine government is concerned, we've already financed our needs for the rest of the year. So we're not worried about that. And as far as the private sector is concerned, we have a lot of liquidity in our Philippine banking system. In fact, in our fiscal stimulus package that we have, the private banks are going to be a very important part of it. What I'm saying is that internal strength is very important to protect ourselves from external shocks. And part of that external shock would be the disappearance of all these funds available to us if a giant like the United States would take it. So fortunately, we've done our homework, we've taken our bitter pill, and that's why what we want is for America to do something, because the last thing we want is for America to do nothing. You may debate on what should be done, but the worst thing is for it not to do anything. Now, the other question was with regard to, what was it?
The idea, I'm curious how much anger there is in the Philippines of just that this originated in America with American excess and too much American borrowing, and whether the rest of the world pays the price, but we can print dollars.
Yes. Well, of course, we know that America is by far the biggest single economy in the world, and we would have wished that this didn't happen, but Filipinos love America. And what we can say is that it's so easy to have 2020 vision on hindsight. When all this easy money policy was very good for the world, for everybody's GDP and our GNP, because we have a lot of remittances coming from America, it was all fine. So then the bubble burst. But did we all know that the bubble was getting to be so big? Professor Stigler maybe was one of the few who knew that. But everybody was benefiting from American prosperity. And as I said, we all didn't want it to happen. Very few saw it happening. So it's not a time for blame tossing. It's a time for looking for the solution.
We have a question here.